So we are good to go now. I do have regrets from Chair Woodbury and Councillor Keaveney. So Vice Chair Soever will take the lead on the meeting today.
Okay, thank you. We'll call the meeting to order. The first item on the agenda is declaration of pecuniary interest. Is there anybody who has a pecuniary interest in the matters that we're going to discuss today? No, okay. So if any should arise during the meeting, please let the clerk know. With that, our next item on the agenda is the presentation by Hempson Consulting. Stefan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to share my screen here. Hopefully that's appearing for everybody. I think we can get straight into it. There's not as much to discuss today, I think, as we have in previous committee sessions. At least I don't have as much material to present. I did want to just follow up with the committee on some of the issues that were raised at the public meeting that was held at the end of October, the development charges public meeting, because there were a number of questions asked, and so I thought I'd just review those with you, but then focus much of the meeting discussing the main provisions of the draft bylaw that was released together with the background study in advance of the public meeting. And I know I've gone over some of those policies in the past with you, so I apologize. There may be a bit of repetition in this particular instance, but we can get into them, some of them in a bit more detail. And I know I was asked by Mr. Schertzer to focus particularly on exemptions in the bylaw, and in particular the non-residential exemption, which has been in place ever since the county first implemented development charges back in 2006. And it was discussed, I think, as part of the last update 5 years ago, and so he wanted to make sure that that was brought forward for discussion today. And then, of course, we can talk about the steps that are required to bring forward a final bylaw for council's consideration. So just in terms of the public meeting comments, and I don't propose to go through them all and the questions and the answers in great detail, but just wanted to make sure that if there are any questions or of clarification about them. So we had a questions from Mr. Nathan Jameson, and he has since provided his questions as part of a formal written submission. So we are currently preparing a written response to that submission. And he asked to clarify the assumptions that we use in the cash flow analysis. So just for committee's understanding, we undertake a cash flow analysis to account for the timing of the works that are going to take place over the planning periods, the 10-year and the 20-year planning periods. So we account for the timing of the works and also the timing of the receipt of the development charges. And so any interest that the county earns on money in the reserve funds and any costs that the county is going to incur as it needs to finance the capital works over the time horizons, they're all accounted for in the calculation of the DCs, and that's permitted under the Development Charges Act. And so, of course, we make assumptions about the rate of borrowing, the rate of inflation, and the rate of interest that's going to accrue on the monies in the funds. And so I will provide details of those assumptions in my written response to Mr. Jameson. But that was really the focus of that particular question.
Stefan, Given the rapid escalation of inflation and in the US, they were predicting, I think, 5.6 or 5.8, and it came in at 6.2. And we're expecting probably on Wednesday to see in Canada, close to 5%. Are you still happy with those assumptions, which probably would have been made a few months ago? And I think people's view is quite different now.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's an excellent point, and in fact, it's even starker in the development charge context, because your charges are are indexed in your bylaw with a view to keeping pace with inflation, and there's a prescribed index for doing it. It's the non-residential construction price index, and the third quarter index came out a few weeks ago, and the year-over-year percentage increase was just over 11%. So that's the highest I've ever seen it. So that is significant, and it's moving very, very swiftly. I guess to your question, which is, have the costs that are in the background study, are they appropriate or not? And it really, I guess, boils down to, what's the point in time at which those costs are to be estimated? And there really isn't any direction in the legislation for this. So, they are supposed to be as of 2021, but whether it's sort of mid-year or year-end we don't really get to that level of detail. I was discussing this with Mr. Schertzer a couple of weeks ago, and I suggested that it's probably, given the background study has been issued, you're probably better dealing with this through your regular indexing of the bylaw. And as I say, that index is linked to that particular prescribed index. And so there is an opportunity through the indexing provisions of the bylaw to keep pace with this. But if there were any major works that were coming ahead in the next few months or the early part of 2022 that are wildly out of line with the costs that are in the background study, perhaps we should sort of relook at the cost of those works. But I don't believe that we've run into that situation on any of the major projects. But I would suggest that trying to claw back, and the costs that we included were as of the early part of the summer. So to try and claw back at this point 4 or 5 months worth of inflation into those costs might be more trouble than it's worth. And I would suggest we leave it, and we can talk more about this when we talk about the indexing provisions, because there may be other ways to deal with this.
Okay, thank you.
The second question related to the way the county funds the exemptions that it currently provides, and with a particular focus on the non-residential exemption. So the purpose behind this question is to make sure that the reserve funds that the county has on hand have properly reflect the fact that exemptions have been provided in the past, so that the funding of those exemptions is not rolled into the charge that's calculated. And the way to make sure that that doesn't happen is that the county should be paying into the reserve fund the equivalent of what any exemption is provided when someone comes along and pulls a building permit. And that's what the county has been doing. That's been the practice for some time. And so I think in our written response, we're going to provide some evidence to support my answer, but my answer stands, which is that the reserve funds are quote unquote whole, and the new charge does not pick up any of the value of the exemptions that have been provided in the past. The next question related to waiting lists for housing and long-term care. And again, the general purpose, I believe, behind this question is to mildly challenge the growth relatedness of some of the housing units that are being proposed to be constructed and the new beds in the long-term care facilities. By way of saying that those are in fact addressing existing deficiencies of service rather than meeting the needs of future growth and development. And to my mind, whether there's a waiting list or not is largely irrelevant. What matters is that, you know, the county is growing. It has a funding tool to allow it to expand its services and fund a portion of that expansion through development charges, provided that its historical level of service does not increase. Or at least it doesn't use development charges to increase that historic level of service. And the background study is quite clear that we are not using DCs to expand the level of service for social housing or long-term care. The charges are capped to ensure that doesn't take place. So whether there's a waiting list or not, to my mind, is not particularly relevant. And then finally, sorry.
I guess we're lucky in that respect, in that Grey Gables was eliminated and it has a waiting list of 161, where Rockwood Terrace only has 72 people on the waiting list. So as of October, so they can't say we're doing anything to fill those waiting lists. That's for sure.
Oh, well, that's interesting, Mr. Chairman. We'll be coming back to Grey Gables on the next slide, though. So
yeah.
Perhaps sort of. And then finally, there were questions about the roads benefit to existing, and that, of course, is, you know, a significant portion, the roads being the significant portion of the charge, and so there's keen interest in how the benefits are allocated between the growth and non-growth components. So I hope I provided enough detail in my answer, and if not, we will certainly provide that in our written response to Mr. Jameson. Mr. McLeese was asking questions about opportunities for development charge credits for water and wastewater infrastructure that had been paid for at Cobble Beach, and Mr. Schertzer, I think, correctly answered that any credits would probably be provided at the lower tier because they're responsible for water and wastewater infrastructure. So that, to my mind, is not too much of an issue for the county. And then there were questions from council about the appropriateness of using per unit charges rather than area-based charges. This question's come up a couple of times. The per unit charges are almost universal across the province. There are no area-based residential charges, and they are, to my mind, problematic because the development charge is fundamentally based on you know, the benefits received tax principle. That is, they're set in order to recover, pay for benefits that accrue to specific properties and the people living in those properties. If you have an area-based charge, then you run the risk of setting the charge on an ability to pay tax principle. That is, you know, someone has more wealth, more ability to pay the charge, should pay more, and that is just a no-go under the Development Charges Act. So,
well, just a question then. So then, how do you justify market value assessment on that basis?
Well, Mr. Chairman, market value assessment is a property tax approach, but the property tax quite clearly is in part an ability to pay tax. There's no question that it's a wealth tax,
which pays for services, as do development charges.
It does, but you know, we have a Development Charges Act that's quite prescriptive about how to go about calculating them, and we cannot use an ad valorem wealth-based approach.
Okay, so if I look at, and I know we can't change it now, but just to make the point is, if I look at what's happened in the Blue Mountains, actually, we have a couple, retired couple living in a large home, very large home, 4,000 square feet. The pandemic strikes, and now they have one of their adult children, their spouse, and two little kids living there. So, which obviously wouldn't be possible if that was a 1,000 square foot home. So, you know, the ability is there, and we've seen that over and over again. They're not the only one. We actually have, well, I can't because there's, but somebody very close to me that works with me here has the same situation. Is now all of a sudden their adult children and grandchildren are living with them. So you go from a 2-person household to a 6-person household, which then basically, you know, triples it. But again, not possible in a smaller house. So just to say that, you know, there is the potential, like we can't limit the number of people in a house. Like the development charges are based on 2.3-person household in the town of Blue Mountains. But, you know, these houses are big enough to be 10 people households quite easily if you got 5 bedrooms, and you can't control that. So if that happens, which is happening with the pandemic, then how do you never recover that? So, you know, it is a tax on wealth, but we do tax wealth all the time. So, you know, I just fail to see the logic there. That's all.
Yeah, no, I see your point, Mr. Chairman. I would suggest that if as a result of the pandemic, there are more people living in the larger homes, that will get picked up in the census, because those people will be recorded in those homes, and the persons per unit the next time round, when we do the charges, the persons per unit should increase for those units, and the charge will increase accordingly. So
because the census data is supposed to come out within a year of this being published or finalized, and that's another question, but we'll leave that for later. But are we able then to adjust this because it falls within a year period for the number of people per household?
Yes, in theory, Mr. Chairman, yes.
Okay. That makes me feel better. Because I know it's happening here. I don't know that it's happening everywhere. We seem to have the largest houses in the county here, so in the Blue Mountains. So maybe it will be significant enough to warrant change. Anyway, thank you.
There were questions about the roads program and the justification for the program, and noting that, you know, the transportation master plan is a few years old now, and these are questions that members of this committee have raised as well. And I think that you know, the answer which Mr. Hoy gave was, you know, we have to deal with the cards that we have, and you know, in an ideal world we would have a brand new TMP, and then the development charge study would flow swiftly afterwards, but often that doesn't happen, and it's certainly not a requirement of the legislation that the county have a transportation master plan in place before calculating a roads charge. And then finally, there were questions about the possibilities for exemptions for small units, less than 1,000 square feet. And certainly that possibility is available to you. Although I think I did sort of caution that if the purpose of an exemption for a small unit is to encourage affordable housing, then that's a fairly blunt way of going about providing an affordable housing exemption, and there are many other tools for doing so, and you indeed have used those tools through your community improvement plan and through some of the other more targeted exemptions you provide through the DC bylaw, which we'll get into as well. before the public meeting, there were two motions submitted by two lower tier municipalities to reintroduce the Grey Gables project into the development charges. And so we discussed, I think, these options. So I just put them up on the screen again for the committee to consider. And option one, obviously, is to maintain the current approach, which is to leave Grey Gables out of the study and the rate calculations. If you wish to reintroduce it into the study, you can do it and amend the rates within 1 year of the release of the background study with no change to the study. Although you will have to undertake another public meeting. And if you want to amend the study and rates in years 2 to 5 of the bylaw, you will have to do an update to the background study and have a public meeting as well. So it's a little bit more involved if you don't do it in that first year.
So just a question, when does that 1 year start? Is it when we pass the bylaw? Because that is when we've actually accepted the study, or is it when does that 1 year time frame trigger? When is that triggered?
I don't think there's a clear answer to that, Mr. Chairman. The Act says it's within 1 year of the release of the background study. And the background study technically is supposed to be released 60 days in advance of the bylaw. What many municipalities will do, however, is they will re-release or formally release a final version of the study with any amendments that are made during the public process and use that as the date of release. So I don't see a problem with that. You know, I'm quite happy to work with staff to sort of do a final consolidated report and put a date stamp of it of, you know, the end of this year for that. I don't think that's going to be a problem.
Thank you.
So then option 2 would be to reintroduce the Grey Gables project into the study and the rate calculations, which following the motions that were received. It wouldn't make any change to the long-term care rate because we're already maximizing the long-term care charge. And I guess the only caution with this particular option is that, you know, the capital program in the study must be a reflection of council's intentions. So if it is not the current intention to proceed with Grey Gables at a certain time frame, which we'd have to show in the background study, at a certain cost, which we'd have to show in the background study, then, you know, you risk running somewhat afoul of the legislation in that respect.
Yeah, so the motion passed at council on this was that it's deferred, but it didn't, it was implied, at least by staff, that this was not a cancellation. I think the anticipation by some of council was that it would fall within the 10-year time frame. Now, if it's not in the study, that means it's post the 10-year time frame. Is that not correct?
If it's not in the study, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not in the 10-year time frame, because you're going to be updating the study in 5 years.
So it's 5 years then.
Yes. I mean, you can obviously always amend the study to bring this back into play. It would be the same process under option 1.
No, I understand.
Mr. Vice Chair, the CAO's hand up.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, not at all. Just to be clear, I want to be clear about available resources to fund additional long-term care projects or any long-term care projects. When you said that right now the charge that we have is maximized, Stefan. Help me to understand then, is there an avenue available to the county to raise additional funds for long-term care projects beyond what we're already planning to raise as the as the bylaws being drafted?
Not through development charges, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so we can add as many projects as we would like to this, but it's not going to impact the amount of money that we can collect or the amount of money that would be available to support future projects. If we add projects in, then we are simply going to have to make decisions about allocating the available resources across all of the projects that are underway. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Randy?
And I guess just further to this, and Stefan may be able to help answer this question in terms of, say, for example, if council decides to move forward with Grey Gables in the next 5 years, and of course, right now, Rockwood Terrace is going for redevelopment to be finished in 2025. So the next DC bylaw update and development charges study update would reflect the Rockwood redevelopment as part of our historical capital, our 10-year historical capital. And therefore, our maximum funding envelope the next go around would increase. Is that fair to say, Stefan?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, yes. In theory, yes.
Thanks for that.
But just a question then, but at the next go around, then our historic levels will be what they are today rather than if we had more beds historically, because we'd be looking back at the Grey Gables beds that weren't built or were built.
Well, Mr. Chairman, whether you raised DCs to fund those beds or not, if the beds are built, they will contribute to your level of service, regardless of how they were funded.
Yeah, no, I understand that. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't, I mean, I'll defer to you, Mr. Chairman, about what to do with this. I mean, I don't know if you were considering a resolution on this matter, but we just presented you the sort of very broad options to deal with the motions that were received at the public meeting. So just moving on to the bylaw exemptions, and this is a slide I know we've shown before. And you'll remember that there are statutory exemptions that are included in the bylaw. And so school boards do not pay development charges on their buildings and structures, neither do municipalities. And there's also a statutory exemption on all industrial building development up to 50% of the existing building. And then recently, the Act was amended to more broadly cover exemptions for secondary suites, whether those suites are within units or detached from units, and whether they are associated with existing dwellings or whether they're associated with new construction. So there's effectively a statutory exemption on all secondary units. And then over and above the statutory exemptions, the county has long-standing exemptions for public hospitals, institutional church uses, agricultural uses that are off municipal services, farm buildings, accommodation for seasonal or temporary agricultural laborers, and then all commercial and industrial uses. And then there was a suite of exemptions that were introduced into the bylaw in 2020. The purpose-built rental housing, which is for all new purpose-built rental units, which is, I think, a building with 4 or more dwelling units, all of which are intended for use for residential uses. And then nonprofit housing, there's an exemption, and there's a definition for nonprofit housing in the bylaw. And if it meets the definition, or if it's supported through, provincial or federal funding for nonprofits, then it is eligible for the exemption. The number 3 here covers those secondary suites, and just mirrors the new legislation. Number 4 is a credit that's now available for redevelopment, whereby non-residential space is converted to residential use. There's a redevelopment credit available, and then there's also conditional exemptions for development that qualifies for incentives that are provided under the community improvement plan. Some other bylaw provisions are the indexing provision, which we've sort of touched on. So the indexing kicks in on the 1st of January. It's a shall index, so it happens automatically. And it's an annual index, so there are some municipalities that will index more frequently. Semi-annual is not unheard of, and I think there's even one municipality that does it quarterly, but I can't remember which one it is. So in cases where the index is fluctuating wildly, then obviously doing it more frequently is better at keeping pace with that. But there are administrative burdens that come with indexing things more frequently than once a year. So the vast majority of municipalities will do it automatically and will do it once a year. There are credit provisions already in the bylaw over and above the one we just discussed. So if a developer demolishes a house or property or it's otherwise sort of destroyed by fire, provided the redevelopment occurs within 5 years, then there is a credit equivalent to the charge that would otherwise have been paid on the old property that's available. Again, the redevelopment credit is very common. A 5-year window for redeveloping is also the typical time frame. There are some municipalities that have sort of longer time periods. There are some that have shorter ones, but it's really about finding that balance between providing enough time for somebody to consider and go through the process of redeveloping, but also providing a bit of an incentive to get on with it, if you like. So 5 years generally is the sort of the most common time frame for that. There are also provisions in the bylaw to ensure that local services are not funded through development charges. Local services are those services for which a developer directly pays for when they subdivide their land. So it's sort of works that are internal to a subdivision or directly related to a subdivision, for which the developer is directly responsible as part of their subdivision agreement. Those services are not funded through the development charge framework, and the county has guidelines for determining what is a local service and what isn't, and those guidelines are being reviewed right now, and they're not really part of the DC study process. They can be approved independently of the study, but they're done to really provide developers with some clarity on what they will be responsible for when they subdivide land. And then finally, there are provisions that allow the county to enter into early or late payment of development charges through agreements, direct agreements with developers. And indeed, I believe that some of the some of the exemptions that were introduced in 2020 are contingent on the county striking those sorts of agreements. So the Development Charges Act allows for those agreements to be struck, and there are provisions in the bylaw to allow the county to enter into them. Just a couple of items, just a bit of information about the value of exemptions. It's just important to remember that the Development Charges Act states that if you're going to offer an exemption, you cannot pay for that exemption through a higher charge on a different type of development. So you have to fund exemptions from non-development charge sources, and invariably that will be the property tax. And so this slide just calculates the revenue shortfall that is funded from the property tax on a typical year. So the non-residential component is around $800,000 a year, and most of that is related to exemptions that are provided to commercial developers. And then for the exemptions that were introduced in 2020, the value of those exemptions is anywhere between $250,000 and $300,000 per year. Although there's a note here that on this particular year, the take-up of those exemptions was quite high, so it was a little bit more than this particular average that's set out here. Some other things to consider for the non-residential exemption is that it's quite rare for a county government that has development charges to exempt all non-residential development. So you'll see here the list of counties for which we've been providing you rate comparisons in recent months. They all have a non-residential development charge. If they do exempt a form of non-residential development, it's almost always, well, it is only the industrial sector, and it's Peterborough and Oxford that exempt industrial outright, but all the others have some form of charge for industrial and non-residential DCs. There may well be discounts built into some of those rates, because what we haven't done is we haven't gone back to the background studies to see whether the rates that are enforced match the maximum rates that could have been imposed. So it may well be that there are discounts here, but all of them except for Peterborough and Oxford have a charge for industrial development. I think the reason why most places impose the charge on commercial development is because there's broad recognition that retail development is relatively uninfluenced by the presence of a development charge. The locational decisions for retail developers are highly contingent on where their customer base is. So they will generally follow the people. And if a place is growing with people, then you will get your local retailers following that growth. It's a little bit different perhaps with the regional serving retail commercial outlets like, the Walmart or an IKEA or something like that, which, has a bit, it's not so dependent on a local customer base. It's much more regional serving, but those are few and far between, and they're quite sort of unique developments. Industrial is slightly different because industrial has some high upfront costs. And so they are a little bit more attuned to the impact of those high upfront costs. But when you look at development charges as a sort of standalone upfront cost, it's not very high on the list. Far more important for an industrial developer will be obviously the property tax rate, the land cost, and a whole bunch of other things. But development charges will won't typically be the sort of the swing vote, if you like, in terms of the locational decision on for an industrial developer. There's been a bit of academic study about this, but not much, because it's quite difficult to prove. But there is some indication that, where one jurisdiction has development charges and the other doesn't, and all other things being equal, an industrial developer, may elect to go, one side of the of the boundary rather than the other, to avoid sort of municipal fees and charges, because they are a little bit more footloose in terms of their locational requirements. If, as long as they're near the highway, for example, and they're moving goods, then that's their main priority. And if they can save a bit on municipal fees and charges, they might go one side of the boundary. But so, industrial development exemptions are provided occasionally as an economic development incentive. And there is some evidence that for some industrial developers, they work. But, for the most part, I think a lot of it is optics. It's the opportunity for municipalities to say, we're open for business, this is what we provide. And I don't want to discount that, but certainly that's a big part of what some of these places are doing as well. So just some considerations for you as you sort of ponder the non-residential exemption moving forward. And then finally, we were asked to review options for treating semi-detached units separately from the single detached unit charge category, with a view to providing an incentive perhaps to developers who are getting into the semi-detached built form. We did a survey of municipal bylaws. We didn't find a municipality that had a specific development charge for semi-detached units. The city of Windsor does include semis as part of the row townhouse category, but that's kind of unusual. It's going to be somewhat difficult, I think, to come up with a firm rationale for a standalone semi-detached unit charge in Grey County, because there's very little information about the occupancy patterns of semis. Semis form less than 2% of the county housing stock, and even then we look at recent construction to try and figure out what the persons per unit should be, and there's really there's not enough data to be sure enough on what that number should be. So we would suggest that if you're going to do something for semis, that you not have a standalone charge for them, you roll them into the rows and other multiple category. And you can see the charge per unit here on the right would be slightly higher with the semis in that category. I should say that, we sort of thought about this quite late in the day, and that is that if we are going to move the semis into the rows and other multiples category, right now we've left the single detached charge the same, because we don't really have a basis for changing it, as I say. But I think if we were going to pursue the option of grouping the semis with the rows, we would have to look at adjusting the singles charge downwards ever so slightly to make sure that this change was revenue neutral. It would be a very slight downward adjustment, but I think in all fairness, it would have to be done, because otherwise we'd be putting forward a charge that is projecting a higher amount of revenue than the current structure. So if the direction is for the committee to move the semis to the rows, we'd probably have to just adjust the singles downwards very slightly and make sure that the new structure was revenue neutral. So just in terms of where council needs to go, there needs to be a resolution not to hold another public meeting. There are right now the draft bylaw would implement the new rates fully under the current exemption structure on January the 1st, which is when the old bylaw expires, with no phase-in or delay to the effective date of the new rates. But of course, you know, you have the option to phase in new rates if you wish, or delay the date at which they become, become effective. The bylaw currently continues all the current exemptions, including the non-residential exemption. These last two bullets, I'm going to defer to Mr. Schertzer here because he wanted me to raise them, but they come from his desk. So Randy, do you mind if you just explain this other consideration for the committee?
Yeah, for sure. So the second last bullet is whether or not to continue with the 2020 exemptions that were put in place in terms of the purpose-built rental housing, the exemptions for nonprofit housing, and some of the other changes that Stefan highlighted previously. As Stefan noted, we did see quite an uptick in terms of the purpose-built rental housing conditional exemptions this year compared to historical average of rental units, that what we used as the basis to calculate or estimate what the exemptions could be. Right now we're sitting at, we've signed 5 deferral and conditional exemption agreements with developers, resulting in just over 160 new rental units being built as we speak. This equates to just over 700,000 in county DCs. So we were estimating previously about 250 to 300,000 per year based on historical builds. So that's almost close to 3 times as high as what we were anticipating. There are 2 pending agreements as well, which would see another 188 rental apartment units being built. So that would equate to another 800,000 potentially in conditional exemptions. Most are in Owen Sound, because Owen Sound also offers currently a DC conditional exemption for purpose-built rentals as well. There was 1 development in Dundalk that received a conditional exemption and 2 pending in Hanover. So the way we've structured the policy around these is that we would continue to monitor the vacancy rates with respect to the current vacancy rate for rental units. And if they return to healthy levels, which is around 3 to 4% vacancy rates, then council could consider lifting these incentives. At this stage, we'd recommend as staff continuing these exemptions. They seem to be working, so to speak, in terms of at least having more rental units within our communities. We also hope that to see more exemptions utilized by our nonprofit organizations so that they can turn those savings into even creating more affordable housing units. So that's something that we would also recommend maintaining. And then we would just continue to monitor this to see where vacancy rates go, and then revisit. Could be even partway through the next term of council, for example, in terms of revisiting that particular exemption. But at this stage, we'd recommend maintaining that. There was one change that we are recommending that's related to that, and that's the last bullet. There's currently the way the purpose-built rental housing exemptions are worded is that if there's any part of a building that's a non-res portion, for example, say if there was a apartment building that's proposed and some commercial ground floor and all residential above. Right now, the way it's currently worded in our DC bylaws is that wouldn't qualify for a purpose-built rental exemption. It could qualify for a CIP incentivized development if it qualified through a community improvement plan incentive. But right now, the way it's worded is that it wouldn't qualify. Staff are actually recommending that we revise that wording to allow for a mixed use building, essentially. And then, of course, depending on the way that committee and council goes with respect to non-res charges, if the decision is to continue to exempt non-res, then we would only look at the conditional exemption for the residential portion of that building. But it would still allow for those opportunities to occur, which aligns with planning policy direction that we want to encourage mixed use development. So that's something that we're actually recommending. And the way we've drafted up the motion that was included with the agenda package for the steering committee was we identified any potential changes that the DC steering committee would recommend. But that is one that staff would recommend that that DC steering committee consider in order to consider these mixed use buildings. We've had one come up. It qualifies under the CIP incentivized program, which is good, but we know that likely we're going to experience some other proposed developments and buildings that are proposing that mixed use. And we would like to see if they could potentially also qualify for a conditional exemption on the residential portion. And that's those two bullets. And if there's any questions on those.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, just to finish up with the timeline from here on in, a reminder that you have two bylaws, one for the roads and one for the general services. They both expire on December the 31st. So in order to continue collecting the charges, you need to have new bylaws in place by the 1st of January.
So then our report could then has to be finalized 60 days before that, right?
No, the 60-day applies to the release of the background study. So that's been done already.
Yeah, but if we wanted to redate that, we couldn't redate it as you suggested when you were talking. If we wanted to do like some municipalities did, it would have to be no later than November 1st, I guess, more or less.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think so. I think that I think you could redate it any date up until the passage of the bylaw and call that the final consolidated version of the study and say that the one that was released on the 60 days in advance was in fact the first version or the draft version for public review.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so go ahead with the timeline.
That was it, really. I wasn't
Okay.
proposing to go through what we've already done,
Okay.
and we've just had the public meeting. So all of this, there are no steps required for council in advance of considering and passing the bylaws. You're in a position now where you can do that. The resolution not to hold another public meeting will be one of the preambles to the bylaw, so that can be dealt with through passing the bylaw. Although I haven't said to Mr. Schertzer, I would recommend that we have a resolution to accompany bylaw passage to that effect. But otherwise, there's nothing stopping council from passing the bylaws right now.
Okay, thank you. And so we have the bullets that were on Randy's slide there, and on the resolution circulated with it, they're just shown as blank bullets, and I think they're quite significant. So how does the committee feel? I think if we're going to address these and make recommendations to council, should we not fill them in? Randy?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, that would be our recommendation, is that depending on the direction from DC Steering Committee, the way we've worded it is that any changes to the bylaws would be reflected in the bullets based on what DC Steering Committee is recommending. So I agree, Mr. Chair, if you can kind of go through these bullets, the way we've structured it, we've got the resolving to not hold another public meeting is kind of built into the current draft motion.
Yeah, I see that.
But if DC steering committee recommended, for example, implementing the full DC rate increase, or phasing in those increases, which has been done in the past, in terms of if there was a big increase from what's currently to the DC rates today, those have been phased in the past. If that's something that the steering committee would want to recommend to council. The whole discussion around non-residential exemptions, in terms of keeping them exempted or considering applying, say, a commercial charge, but maybe not an industrial charge, or both, charging both. I think it'd be good to have at least a recommendation from the steering committee in terms of which direction to go with respect to those exemptions, and then maintaining whether or not you want to maintain the 2020 exemptions, the whole purpose-built rental, CIP incentives, nonprofit exemptions, and then that one recommended change that staff are recommending in terms of allowing that mixed-use building for conditional exemptions. So, yeah, I think what you indicated, Mr. Chair, is maybe kind of going through these bullets one by one and having a discussion with the steering committee in terms of what direction they would like to provide to council. And then Clerk Morrison can kind of keep track of those bullets and then make any notes to those bullets. And then maybe at the end of all the discussion, then the motion can be considered by the steering committee.
Okay, thank you. As chair, I'll open the floor to the other members of the committee. I shouldn't be guiding the discussion. I should be listening and then speaking last. So the only other bullet that I would add is we had a discussion of what we do with the semis. So
that's right. I forgot about that one. You're correct, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments? Starting with implementation options, full or partial rates, or do we go with phased in or delayed effective dates? Okay, I think Selwyn, you had your hand up first, or next.
I did, Mr. Chairman. If we're dealing with the implementation options, I lean in favor of the full implementation.
I see Councillor Carlton nodding, and I would agree. So let's pick full there. That one was easy. The non-residential exemption. Go ahead, so.
So on the non-residential exemptions, I think we should be in line with our neighbors. I really, those numbers are quite telling, and the points made by Stefan were influential on my decision anyways. I would vote that we're yes and yes in terms of the non-residential DCs and the industrial DCs.
Councillor Carlton?
I would agree there.
I would agree too. I mean, I think we are a popular area, and I don't think the DCs are gonna, be an impediment.
Influential, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, deferral or conditional DC exemptions for purpose-built rental buildings. Go ahead.
So once again, I'm in favor of keeping the 2020 exemptions and going along with the recommendation that we just monitor.
Councillor Carlton?
Again, I agree there. Yes.
Okay, I agree. So that is done. Okay. Okay, in the mixed-use building exemptions, so if we are bringing in the non-res commercial DCs, they would still be payable on the commercial units, correct, Randy?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. So if the non-res charge is applied, so the ground floor commercial, for example, those uses, there would be a square meter charge that would be applied to the commercial. And then the remaining floors of residential apartments, for example, could still then be conditionally exempted. And we would look at obviously updating the wording in the bylaw. If steering committee agreed to that change, we would work on wording to reflect that. And then we'd also look at updating the deferral and conditional exemption policy, which would be following the DC bylaw changes that would be approved by council. So that's something that staff would be able to work on for sure.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I would agree that go, but I'll let the others speak first, I guess. Well, I already did, so. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do support the staff recommendation in this regard.
Go ahead. Well, we
I
didn't hear
support the
that.
staff recommendation as well.
Okay, very good. Okay, so that's supported, Randy. And okay, now the semis. How do people feel about grouping them with row houses and multi-unit? Go ahead.
Yeah, I have to admit, this is one that I'm not fully understanding. I heard the presentation, but it's not sinking in properly. I think I want you folks to maybe have some more discussion because I'm not fully understanding this. I'm not understanding this issue.
Okay, go ahead, Randy or Stefan.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So currently, in your bylaw, you have a charge. You have 3 charges for residential development, and the charge is higher for larger units and smaller for smaller units. And when I say larger or smaller, I mean that units with a higher average occupancy, more people living in them on average than the smaller units. The highest charge applies to a category of unit that picks up a single detached form and a semi-detached form collectively. And then the second, the next level of charge applies to row houses, townhouses, and other multiple built forms. And then the third one picks up all kinds of apartment forms. And the singles and semis is obviously a blended rate in that it's the persons per unit that's assumed for that category assumes a certain number of people for singles and then a certain number of people for semis, and it kind of blends them together. But because there are hardly any semi-detached units in Grey County, it's basically a single detached unit charge. And so if the idea is that in the future, we may be moving to a period where developers are considering constructing semi-detached units, and the development charge can act as an incentive for those kinds of builders to build those kinds of units. The question is, can we take the semis out of the singles charge and put it into the rows charge? It would increase the rows charge because we would have to account for the fact that the average persons per unit for that category of units would go up because the semis would probably incorporate a higher number of people than, the smaller townhouses. But it would still be far less than what the semis would pay if they were lumped in with the singles. So the county obviously has discretion to sort of mix and match to do this. And, we've gone and calculated what we think the new charge would be with the semis included with the rows. And it's about, what's about $200, a little bit more than $200 per unit higher. That, assuming you do actually start building semi-detached units in a significant way, having that extra charge is going to mean that you raise more money overall. And so in order to account for that, we would have to, I think, reduce the singles charge ever so slightly to make sure that this change in the structure of the charge didn't result in the county raising more money than it should. So changing the structure of the charge should not alter the total amount of money you raise through DCs. And because most of the development that occurs is in singles anyway, the adjustment to the singles would be very minor. But I think, it might be in the order of like $20, $30 a unit. But I think we would have to do that in order to make sure that it's revenue neutral. So honestly, my view is that in terms of the revenue raised, there's going to be no change. In terms of its value as an incentive, that really depends on, how many developers are considering building semi-detached units, because to date, there's been very little evidence of those kinds of units being built. So, as I say, I'm not sure I'm in a position to sort of make a recommendation to you. I think that there is a small risk of appeal here, because anytime you change the rate structure, it can attract attention because there will be some winners and there will be some losers. But this is a fairly minor change to the rate structure, so I would say the risk is fairly low. But I think it's important to state that. And I guess the only other thing to say is that most municipalities, when they set the charge, they include the semis with the singles. So as I said, certainly in Windsor, we found this approach, so it's not unheard of, and Windsor's a sophisticated place. And so I don't think there's any, you're not falling foul of the legislation in any way, but it's an unconventional approach, but certainly an option available to you. So I don't know whether that provided a bit more detail to it, but.
Go ahead, so.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Am I to understand from the chart, slide number 9, 16 in the package? When I look at that chart on the side, am I understanding properly that the impact of moving semis from detached into rows and other multiples would be that rows and other multiples go up from 6192 to 6428?
That's correct.
And so when you talk about winners and losers, is the loser then the rows?
That's correct.
Doesn't that go against what we want to encourage? Don't we want to encourage rows?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I suppose yes, although you are also encouraging semis by reducing the charge for them from $89.68 to $64.28. So whenever you change it for one unit, it's going to affect the other units somewhat. So as I say, any change like this, there's going to be winners and losers. But if the intent is really to focus in on promoting semis as a viable form, then they're going to pay whatever it is, $2,500 less, but that will have a slight bearing on the other units in that category. That's right.
Sue, you had your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess My question would be, why do we want to provide an incentive to have more semis? I guess in my mind, building those semis, there's cost savings in them to start with. So why does the county need to provide more of an incentive, or what would be our reasoning in doing that?
Well, we've considered that here in the Blue Mountains, and we do have quite a few semis are being built now. I think Windfall Phase 6, correct me if I'm wrong, Randy, but it's 166 units they're proposing now, of which 58 are singles and 108 are semis.
That's correct.
So the semis do lead to densification, more, it's a better use of land, less sprawl, and smaller units, and they are serving the missing middle in that the pricing tends to be lower than large single homes. And, you know, I think we're all seeing throughout Grey County that, you know, even, you know, teachers, physiotherapists, people like that aren't earning $100,000 plus can't afford to live here anymore because, you know, the average house price in the Blue Mountains in September was, I think, 1.4 million. So it's, we need the semis. We also need the rows and other multiples. And, you know, I think my preference would be to have 3 different rates, you know, the singles, semis, and rows and other multiples, and going down. And that is moving towards a square footage charge. I mean, it's not really. And obviously, you know, depending on how big your semi is, you could have just we don't have a lot of population data on that. That's true because we don't have a lot of semis, but perhaps that's because we weren't offering a discount. I mean, it's not a lot when you're talking about a $500,000 house, $2,500. You know, it's money, but it's, what is that? 0.5%. You know, it's not, when you do the math, it's not a big impact on the sales price. But, you know, I think our problem here is, you know, you require large lots, large single homes, and, you know, high DCs, and it's pretty hard to get any attainable housing. So if we were to want to do semis, is my question, then you'd have to calculate some kind of occupancy for those. But then we know our occupancy numbers, which are based in 2016, are probably out of whack anyway, so.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we can do it. It would just be a bit of a shot in the dark, frankly, in terms of you know, getting the occupancy right. But we can certainly do it. As I say, taking them out of the singles will still mean that we have to bring the singles charge down somewhat. And I'm just looking here. I'm trying to find out sort of just how many. Like right now, you know, we've got around 800 semi-detached units in the county altogether, and only about 10% of that was constructed in the last 10 years, in the 10 years between 2006 and 2016. So there's not much to go on in terms of and the occupancy of those units is actually a little bit higher than the singles, which to me just tells me that the data is just not sufficient to come up with a proper number. So, I mean, I think we're going to have to, we may have to look at other jurisdictions in order to sort of come up with something, but, you know, as
well, yeah, and I don't expect that the occupancy will be wildly different. It's a different demographic. I mean, I've always, well, most of my life I've lived in the semi till I moved up here. So and that was when I had, a family of 4. And next door, there was the grandmother and grandfather too. And so they were a family of 6 in a semi. So it's more family unit oriented than size. If you have a large single, you still, have the same number of people. It just, I don't know. But the semi is not so much for the town, but not so much for the county, but for the town. If you have semis, you build, more compact, so you actually save money on servicing, and like kilometers of road, meters of sewer line. We don't do, of course, with the county water and sewer, but the roads have to be shorter the more people you have living close together. So there is a saving to having semis. Go ahead, Selwyn.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to recommend that we leave things alone, that we keep what we have. I don't think the impact is huge. It's 2% of our housing stock, and I'm not really comfortable with what I'm hearing would be a deleterious impact on the row housing.
Yeah, and I would suggest that we do the unconventional thing and just break out semis so that you end up with 3 classes. So Randy, if I built a triplex, so 3 houses, that would be a row house.
That's correct.
But if
Row
I built,
houses and other multiples.
yeah. So, but if you're 2, then you're a semi.
Correct.
Okay. Go ahead, Sue.
I guess I'm looking at this and seeing the staff recommendation to keep the current structure. I think that's what I would tend to go with as well.
Okay, since there's 3 of us and we have 2 votes for that, I guess that's what we put in there.
It's so agreeable.
Okay. Anything else, Randy? We've got them all now, the bullets?
I think so. I think legal is just doing a kind of a sweep through of the bylaws. There may be some minor revisions and tweaks to the bylaws before we bring them back to council. And we'll, of course, highlight any specific tweaks or changes that we make in terms of the wording, etc. But for the most part, I think that captures the bulk of the main points that we wanted to get direction from the steering committee today. And then the minutes from the steering committee will go to the November 25th council meeting, correct, Heather? And so there will be, of course, an opportunity for all of council to discuss and weigh in on any of the bullets. And I'll prepare a brief presentation just kind of outlining some of the proposed changes to the DC bylaw so that council is aware of those changes. And then, of course, the bylaws staff will then prepare and finalize the bylaws and bring those forward to the December 9th council meeting is the plan at this stage.
Okay, very good. Okay, so we have can we put up the resolution so we can see the bullets, Madam Clerk?
Yes, we can. I'd like to just ask a clarifying question of Mr. Schertzer, if I may. Randy, do we need to determine what we're doing for the Grey Gables redevelopment piece, or are we going to deal with that in a separate resolution?
Yes. Yeah, if there's a change in terms of what's currently laid out, which is, of course, currently the DC background study doesn't include the Grey Gables option at this stage, and as discussed, we have the ability to add that back in should council decide to move forward with that earlier than what's currently maybe anticipated. So that's that option is always available to council to make those amendments at the time. But if there was a change in that, then we would want to probably reflect that in the motion as well.
Committee members?
They're
Go
looking
ahead.
for us to weigh in
Selwyn
on.
and-
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Are you looking for us to weigh in on Heather's comment with respect to Greg
Yes.
Gables?
Yes.
Yeah. I think that I would be in favor of no change right now. I'm not convinced that option 2 that was presented to us is even a legitimate option at this point in time, given council's decision to pause Greg Gables for now. So I would, for that reason, I would be in favor of not making any change right now.
Okay, so that's Councillor Carlton.
I would agree there. I think because we've got the option to add it back in within a year if we wanted to, I'm comfortable with leaving it out for now.
Okay, so with that, I'm comfortable with that as well, but we should give us ourselves as long as possible in that year, because otherwise, if there is a change over that time period, then so can we put something in there that a final version of the development charges background study be prepared and dated as of the date it is brought to? When's the last date we can date it?
I look to Stefan for this in terms of date. I know we've consolidated DC background study. Even I think we've dated it for the date the bylaw was passed. Is that correct, Stefan?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually you'd probably be able to have it December the 31st, which is the date of expiry of the old bylaw. I don't see a problem with that.
Okay, that would be good.
Okay, so I will attempt to share my screen then with the resolution. Can everyone see the resolution there? So I've added the bullet points in here and I'll read them out for the committee members. Full implementation of development charges effective January 1st, 2022. Deferral of non-residential development charges for industrial development, but not commercial development. Continue with approved deferral or conditional development charge exemptions. Allow for mixed-use deferrals as long as a portion of the build is purpose-built rental housing. Semi-detached homes remain with single detached homes, and Greg Gables remain excluded from the background study.
And could we have something in there on the date?
Randy, can I put an effective?
And that's, and maybe it's in that staff work with Hempson to prepare a final consolidated version of the development charges background study to be effective the end of December 2021, or something along those lines. I just wanted to clarify the fourth bullet, if I may. I don't know if we can add words allow for mixed use deferrals and conditional exemptions as long as a portion of the build is purpose-built rental.
Yes.
And then I wasn't sure on just to clarify with the DC steering committee about bullet number 2, was it?
Number 2, yeah, I was confused as well.
Okay, that's fine. I'm happy to take those changes.
And I think 2 was, if I heard correctly, was to apply non-residential development charge for both industrial and commercial. Was that
Yes.
correct?
Okay.
And actually, Mr. Chairman, might I suggest that it read apply development charges to all non-residential development, just in case there may be some kind of non-commercial, non-industrial that sort of falls through the crack there unless it covers all.
So apply development charges to all non-residential development.
Yeah, I think that's
Can
clear.
Well,
Can
here's
I
the-
ask a question?
Go ahead, Kim.
If we're going to make a change like this, which I have no objection to, but if we're going to go take away those exemptions for commercial industrial, should we be talking about phasing then for those? Or are you prepared to just, I feel like to not have a public meeting and to not talk about phasing, I just don't know enough about what might be out there that we could be really criticized about something that's, or do you think people have had ample opportunity to put up their hand about how they wanted to keep something they've had for forever?
Go
Yeah,
ahead, Randy.
further to that, that's definitely an option that the steering committee can recommend to council, is to consider phasing in the commercial industrial and you know, like I said, some of the past where there's a significant change in the DC rates that's been phased in the past. This one's not, I'd say, a significant change on the residential rates, but the commercial industrial, yeah, we're going from 0 to charging whatever the calculated rate is, and I can't remember off the top of my head. But so
It's considerable.
it is considerable. So that's an option to recommend that be phased in. We've seen phase-ins in the past that council supported where it's 25% increases over over a 4-year period, or 50% year 1, 100% year 2 is an option. So those are definitely options that are available for the DC steering committee to recommend to council. And I'll leave it at that.
Because we don't really have time for another public meeting, I don't think.
No.
Correct. And we did identify wording in the draft DC bylaws to under the exemption category to be exemptions to be considered by council. So we flagged and we highlighted that these could change. But CEO Kim's right in terms of this is a significant change from what we've currently provide in our DC bylaws. So that may be something that the steering committee may want to consider in terms of the option to phase in that increase.
If I may, Mr. Chair, could it just say to the end of that second bullet, apply development charges to all non-residential development phased in over the next, you're suggesting 2, is it 2 or 3 years to get to 100%?
Yeah, I think whatever steering committee recommends, we've seen it 2 or 4 years, but it could be a 3-year, be just a third with a little bit extra on the end, last one. But yeah.
Why don't we just say over a period of time? This is just a recommendation to committee of the whole after all.
That's right. We could, that's a good suggestion. Yeah.
So then I'm going to just, if you don't mind, full implementation of residential development charges then?
No, all
Yes.
develop. Well,
I would.
all of these are going in on the first, aren't they?
They would be, except the second bullet, if
Oh,
steering
okay.
committee was recommending to phase in so it'd be full phase rates, no phase in for residential, and then potentially phasing in then the non-residential charge.
Okay, that looks good.
So does that second bullet also need an effective Jan 1 to be, or is that?
Yeah, the bylaws would be effective that date, starting in
Yeah.
January 1. So, and then I guess what we'll need then for council to make a determination or decision on what that second bullet phase in period is. And just looking to Stefan, do we kind of need to know that now to figure out in order from a timing perspective to prepare those rates and those schedules in the amended DC bylaw, or if we get the decision from council on the 25th, will that give you enough time to finalize those and bring them forward December 9th?
Yeah, we can certainly, that's enough time to pull together the rates. The combinations are endless, of course. So, you may have a lengthy debate on the 25th as to how best to do it. So, I mean, maybe if I could just weigh in here that, the two things to decide on are, of course, the term of the phase in. And I would suggest that in the first year, will that be a zero charge? Or will the first year actually have like 25% of the fully calculated charge? So some places will phase in over 5 years. Year one will be zero. Then you go 25, 50, 75, 100. And then other places will start at the 25 and get to the 100 by year 4. So you'll have 2 years of the full rate. So those would be the two, I would say, major points of discussion that most municipalities grapple with.
So if you go with zero the first year, and then you might see a whole bunch of development start happening right away, because they want to miss paying the 25% the next year.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's possible. I mean, I guess the other side to that is that a lot of developers will say, well, we've done our pro formas. We were going to build in January or February anyway. We didn't count on this being part of our costs. And you need to recognize that, we're late in the game. We can't make any adjustments to account for this. So that's the argument you normally get.
Yeah, but if you're zero the first year, then as long as they get their building permit, I guess they're good.
That's right.
Randy's got a lot of work to do the first year then.
If I could too, that may tie in well with obviously we're still recovering from the pandemic, both on the commercial and industrial side as well. So that may be another incentive for, hey, if you're wanting to move forward with your development, 2022 is the year. Just wanted to throw that out there as a potential discussion, but
Yeah. Okay, Mary Lou, you've been waiting patiently.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my only concern is we only have the one meeting in December, so December 9th. So we need to make sure that we can get this passed before the end of the year. Otherwise, we're sitting without a bylaw.
Yeah, I think the plan is 25th. It comes to committee of the whole, and then it will be the 9th will be passed.
Yes, it will actually, development charges committee minutes come straight to council. So we'll have that discussion at council at next week's meeting. And if council approves the recommendations from the development charges steering committee, then we'll prepare the bylaws for the 9th.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I guess we're good to go then with that resolution. So I need a mover and a seconder. Moved by Councillor Carlton, seconded by Warden Hicks. We'll call the question. All in favor? It's carried.
excellent.
Okay, so that was that. Other business? Anybody with other business?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, could we deal with the correspondence that was received by both?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, we jumped correspondence. So we have 3 items of correspondence related to which we just passed. So I guess we have a motion to receive for information. We did discuss them and they were discussed. So moved by Warden Hicks, seconded by Councillor Carlton. So it's carried.
Can I just ask a question there? I think Hempson is sending answers back to each of those. Will committee actually get to see what those replies are, what the responses are, just for our own information?
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Chairman. We can provide that to you in time for the 25th. No, that's not a problem.
Okay.
I should say, though, I think we were only planning on responding to Mr. Jameson. I'm not sure what the other two items are. Are they the motions from the municipalities, or?
Yeah, there'd be the motions for the municipalities.
So we weren't, Mr. Chairman, planning on responding to those, just
Okay.
Mr. Jameson's letter.
Oh, okay, so since the chair of the committee isn't here, maybe we could have a motion that the chair of the committee will respond to the municipalities.
Chairman, I don't know that we need to respond. I think it would be noted as received in the minutes.
Oh, okay, very good.
Yes, and what we can do, Mr. Chair, is from the clerk's department, send each Grey Highlands and Town of Blue Mountains a letter just noting that they were received for information by the Development Charges Steering Committee.
That would be very good. Okay. So with that, we're to other business then. There is none, so I take a motion to adjourn. Moved by Council Carlton, seconded by Warden Hicks, so it's carried.